Emily Strasser, how are you?
Hi, I'm doing great. How are you?
Very good. Good to see you. Where are we talking to you?
I'm in my bedroom in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
I've been to Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Have you? What brought
Luckily,
you
I,
here?
I was there in a June.
Okay.
But
So,
yeah, I've heard everyone talked about how cold it is in the winter there.
yeah, June is beautiful. June's our best month.
Yeah, I went to see the Twins play the Brewers
Okay.
while I was there. So it
Okay.
was it was it was quite exciting. It's a really good town, and you can tell it must be cold all there because in the downtown area the buildings are connected with walkways, so you don't have to go outside.
Yep, you got the tunnels. Yeah, and we're
But
in a polar vortex now, so it's extra
is it
extra.
so? What's the weather like there right now?
I haven't checked this morning, but it's been getting down to the negative 30s with the wind chill.
Okay,
That's Fahrenheit, so
Fahrenheit, yeah, but still
yeah,
cold.
still cold. Yeah.
All right, let's talk about your fabulous podcast. And thanks for appearing on the Pod 20. For those who are watching on YouTube, the Pod 20 is a chart countdown show, 5 o'clock, 5 p.m. UK time, where every week I count down the top 20 podcasts in the world. And one of them is a podcast called The Bomb. It's a series, and it's quite an amazing thing. It really is. Well, you're going to find out about that. It's about the first atomic bomb. And it turns out that, Emily, you have a family connection to it.
Yeah, that's right. So my grandfather was a chemist, kind of a mid-level chemist who worked on enriching uranium for the first atomic bomb.
So was he doing that at Los Alamos with all the others, or was that
So,
outside?
yeah, he was actually in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. So Los Alamos was one of three sort of secret cities that were built to help build the atomic bomb. Los Alamos was where sort of the most important scientists and the most famous people were, but in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, they enriched uranium, and in Hanford, Washington, they produced plutonium.
And how did you find out about your father's involvement?
Yeah, my grandfather.
Like I say, your
There,
grandfather.
yeah, no worries. Yeah, so it wasn't something that my family talked about all that much, but there was this photograph that I remember very distinctly from my childhood that hung above the bed in my grandmother's house where I would sleep when I visited her, and it showed my grandfather standing in front of a like a mushroom cloud, like a nuclear test blast. I didn't really know what it was at the time. My grandfather died before I was born, so it wasn't something I didn't know him. Um, and as I got older, I started to think about that photograph and wonder, like, what it was all about. It's such a very strange thing to see in a house and to have hanging above a child's bed. Now, the weird addendum to that is I remember that so well. I would have signed an affidavit about it, right? I would have said, this photograph exists exactly how I remember it, and it has since completely disappeared. We cannot find it in the family. So we do have he did work on the atomic bomb, and we do have photographs of him of atomic test blasts, but I'm not exactly sure what happened in my childhood memory, whether it just has been lost or whether I sort of put two things together.
How old were you at the time then?
Um, let's see, that house, I mean, that house is still in the family. After my grandmother died, we kept it. But I only slept there probably till about age 10 or so. And then, you know, people would rearrange photographs and take things down. And after my grandmother died, a lot of things were rearranged. So I can't say exactly when it disappeared.
So your memory of this photo, there's a mushroom cloud going on behind him, and he's not standing in front of a poster of a mushroom. He's actually there at a test.
Yeah, well, and he did go to tests. Like, I know that he went to tests, so it's possible.
So, and those tests would have been, where would they have done them? Did they do them at
Yeah.
Los Alamos then?
So they did them out in Nevada at the Nevada test site. This was after, so he worked on nuclear bombs like through the
Oh,
Cold
I
War
see. Yeah, because they
into
were
the
done.
80s. Yeah,
People in Vegas used to go and watch them, didn't they?
yeah, it's
So it
so
was
wild.
right. So he was. I see. So that was taken afterwards when he was. So he was still working on it after the bomb. He was part of it then.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, a lot of scientists left after the bomb, either because there weren't as many jobs at first until the Cold War really ramped up. Some people had moral objections, but he stayed on, which is part of my mixed feelings about the whole thing.
I bet. So, did you ask questions about the photograph?
Yeah, I mean, I started to ask after it was not until college that I started to wonder about it really, and look.
And no one in the family talked about it.
No, it was just kind of, I mean, it wasn't exactly covered up, right? It just wasn't. Nobody seemed to have much interest in it. It was like, oh yeah, Grandpa George worked on nuclear weapons, and that was all that I ever heard of it. And so I started to ask questions, and I started to research Oak Ridge, Tennessee, which again was this really wild place. So it was built in 1943 in total secrecy. It wasn't even listed on area maps of the time. And the vast majority of people who worked there, everyone from mid-level scientists like my grandfather to, say, janitors, bus drivers, I should say, it was built not only to house the laboratories, but all of the people needed to clean the laboratories, to build the laboratories, all the people working in the laboratories, all of their families, the school teachers, the kids. So it was there were 70,000 people living there at the height of the war effort. So it was this huge top secret facility, and most of the people working there had no idea what they were doing.
Right. So it was only the scientists that knew what they were actually working on. Everyone else just thought it was part of the war effort, a military
just a war
research.
Yeah, just a good war job. Yeah. And even of the scientists, only the top really had the whole picture. Right.
So how did you then find out that he was a chemist and he was a big deal?
Yeah, so some of it was like family, the family, what they were able to tell me, but I had to do a lot more digging, talking to historians, and eventually I was able to get some archival records of sort of what he did more specifically. This was kind of a lucky research break, but I actually found somebody who worked in the same lab as him during the war, and so that was pretty incredible. Was able to interview him before he died, and he was able to tell me exactly what they had been doing.
And do you know his level of involvement in it then?
Yeah. So as far as I can figure, he was sort of a mid-level guy. He wasn't famous. He would later kind of become more of a manager and, get to be up at the higher echelons of plant management in the Cold War. But at that time, he was like a mid-level guy who did a good job, who had a science background, and kind of rose to supervise a small lab. And probably wasn't briefed on the whole story, but there was enough of the science out at the time that he may have been able to guess what he was doing.
Yeah. Now, as history has shown us, that bomb and the Hiroshima bomb and the Nagasaki bomb a few days later, they ended the Second World War effectively, because I think the Japanese surrendered within a week of the second bomb.
Mm-hmm.
Now that you've definitely got this family connection, are you proud of your grandfather or ashamed of him?
That's a complicated question, and basically, that's been was part of my driving interest in doing this research and writing. I've done a lot of research and writing on this outside of the podcast. I would say that whether or not the bombs were necessary to ending the war, as far as I have researched, is still a matter of historical debate, and I don't claim to be a historian who takes a side on that. Nagasaki is a stickier issue because there were only 3 days, and everybody was kind of freaking out and trying to figure out what was going on. So people are.
When you say only 3 days, do you think that Japan was not given enough time after the first bomb to surrender?
Some people argue that. Some people who say that Hiroshima was important to ending the war say that Nagasaki was not necessary, was sort of a cruel kind of last attack that wasn't necessary. And they say that the real reasons for Nagasaki were that they wanted to keep the Soviets out of the war, and they wanted to try out a plutonium bomb. So they had two kinds of bombs. And
the second, because the first bomb, Little Boy, was a different. The Hiroshima one was different to Fat Man, which went on Nagasaki. Are you suggesting that there might have been a motivation there from the scientists that they wanted to try this other kind of bomb before it was too late?
Well, it wouldn't have been the scientists. It would have been the military.
Okay.
The scientists didn't get to decide how it was used. And part of the story that we're telling with Leo Szilard in the podcast shows some of the scientific opposition, actually, to the bombs being used at all.
Right.
Now, some scientists were for it and some were against it. I'm sure there was some scientific curiosity, about how a kind of morbid fascination, right? How is this thing going to work?
Scientists, yeah, this is brand new science, and that's exciting for any scientist, except this is incredibly destructive. But what your research found was, if anyone was driving this, it was more likely the military than the scientist.
Yeah, absolutely. They had much more control, and they kind of designed the whole project that way.
Yeah, it is a weird one to debate. The way I always saw it, and I know nothing about it, I haven't read anywhere near as much about it as you have, but it seemed that the narrative that I understand, right or wrong, and maybe you can shed some light on this for me, is that Japan was not likely to surrender. They were going to go to the bitter end. A ground invasion of Japan would have cost who knows how many lives, and it mightn't have ended it. We're 6 years into a war that people are fed up with, and to bring it to the current day and perspective, we're fed up of this pandemic thing, and it hasn't been a year yet, and we just want life to get back to normal. And I just wonder if there was just a desire to just end this thing so we can get back to normal, and that this just seemed like a quicker way to end it, which could have saved lives because you wouldn't have had a protracted ground war in Japan. From what you've learned, are my feelings on that close or nowhere near?
Again, it's a matter of a lot of debate, and I should also say that I'm speaking for myself, not the BBC. I should have said that
absolutely.
At the beginning. And
yeah.
So this is a very contentious matter, and I'm not, taking a stand that represents that any kind of official position there.
But the feeling you got from doing your research.
Yeah, sorry, you're breaking up a little. So
I was just wondering what the feeling you got from doing your research about the motivation to drop the bomb. I never thought about that with the second one, though. But
yeah.
Did you get the feeling that people just wanted to end the war?
Where I come down, I think Nagasaki is very sticky and may not have been necessary. It's so complicated when you get to Hiroshima, and what do you say by necessary, and how do you know how many people would have died in a land invasion, because that's an estimate.
Yeah.
I think what I'm more interested in, and it may sound like I'm dodging your question, which maybe I am a little, but
that's okay. You're allowed.
I've kind of taken the stance that a lot of people have written and argued about the question of whether they were justified or not, and I think it's a legitimate and important argument, but I'm kind of interested in what the legacy of the fact that we used the bomb was, and what it unleashed. And so, the thing that the scientists were worried about was an arms race. That was a big part of why they opposed it. And then we get an arms race, and we get escalation, and we get the Cold War.
Who was worried about? The military were worried about an arms race?
No, the scientists.
The scientists worried about an arms race. Did they have anyone did they have Russia in mind?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Right. So they were thinking we need to keep. So there were some people thinking we should keep the genie in the bottle.
Yeah, we shouldn't use it, or we shouldn't start this precedent. So Leo Szilard, the guy who this podcast is focused on, this was a big part of his concern, that he thought that once we use a nuclear weapon, it does let the genie out of the bottle, right? Other people are going to feel justified in using it. Other people are going to want to develop one.
Yeah.
Now, they also didn't know at this point that Germany had abandoned their efforts to build the bomb.
Yeah.
So, there were gaps in information there.
And they'd also surrendered in May as well, and this was in the August when they dropped it.
Right, well, and that was part of their opposition, that a lot of the scientists had been motivated by trying to defeat the Nazis, and they thought that a lot of them were Jewish refugees, including Leo Szilard, so it was very personal for them.
Yeah.
So they thought, and they also had reason to believe that the Germans were developing a bomb and were also ahead of the Americans. So there was this feverish rush, and there was this idea of, it's going to be so terrible if, imagine Hitler with a nuclear bomb. an absolute nightmare. So I understand.
And he already
why
had
they
rockets.
pursued that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
In fact, the Germans abandoned their bomb project early in the war, but the Americans didn't know that. And so once they surrendered, that's kind of when some of the scientific opposition came out. And not all the scientists. It was still a small percentage were kind of taking a stand. Some people just said, my job as a scientist, like, I'm not going to get politically involved. Some people supported the use. But a small group were very adamant in their opposition. And some people suggested that we should do a demonstration of the bomb. So, like, drop it on an abandoned island and tell the Japanese, this is what we'll do to you if you don't surrender.
Yeah. Yeah. Or even maybe, I don't know, a military target. Although I'm sure they justified Hiroshima as a military because it had industry and stuff, but it wasn't a naval base, which would have seemed the more obvious target, for something that for that scale.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, now you mentioned Leo Szilard. He's a figure who I'd never heard of until your podcast. He was a Hungarian refugee into the U.S., is that correct?
That's right.
But he was a scientist. Tell me about him then.
Yeah, so he was a Hungarian Jewish refugee, grew up in Budapest, moved to Berlin, and then moved to Berlin after World War I, and then fled Berlin, obviously with the rise of the Nazis, and was in London for a short while for several years actually, before he came to the U.S. So he's kind of this tragic figure. I kind of understand him this way because he's the guy who basically comes up with the nuclear chain reaction that makes the bomb possible. And then
why is he not better known for that? It's all Oppenheimer and Einstein, but not him.
Yeah. And he's actually the guy. So we know Einstein because he wrote the letter to Roosevelt that basically started the Manhattan Project. Yeah. But actually the reason he wrote that letter, and he didn't even write it, Leo Szilard wrote the letter and went to Einstein. He was a friend. And he said, look, this is a huge threat. This is how it could work. And Einstein, who had been previously unconvinced that an atomic bomb could work, was convinced by Leo Szilard and signed that letter that went to Roosevelt. So Szilard is instrumental, both sort of scientifically and politically, in making this thing happen.
Yeah. But he was trying to stop it, wasn't he?
Yeah. So later on, I mean, his fear was, like all the scientists, like I said, was that the Nazis would get the bomb. But later on, increasingly, I think he was distressed by the way the military was controlling the bomb. Decisions were being taken out of the hands of scientists. This beyond his control, right? He wanted to have a measure of control over how it would be used. And after Germany surrenders, he gets very worried about the precedent this sets, the possibility of an arms race. He thinks it's morally unjustifiable to drop this bomb on Hiroshima. And so he tries to stop it in a variety of different ways. He tries to reach the president. He tries to reach top military leadership. And eventually, in sort of a last-ditch effort, he circulates a petition among some of the top scientists and there's different versions of the petition. So something between 70 and 150 signatures opposing the use of the bomb.
Yeah. Do you think he's been written out of history because of his point of view on that?
It's interesting because that petition was actually classified until 1961, which I find fascinating because it doesn't have any, secret scientific information. It doesn't tell someone how to make a nuclear bomb. And it kind of aligns with a lot of the period right after the war. There was a lot of, firsthand accounts of the effects of the bombing. Some of the first film footage was classified. And, there was this concerted effort to control the narrative around the bomb, to justify the bombing, and maybe more importantly, to justify the continued use or the continued creation of nuclear weapons as we go into the Cold War, right? And so this is a speculation. I don't know exactly why that petition was classified, but I imagine it doesn't fit into the narrative to have all these scientists who are opposing the use, right? They want it to be this heroic war effort.
Yeah, because you mentioned how the government were keeping tabs on him. There's a part in the podcast where you talk about him having he goes for breakfast every day. Was he in Chicago at the time?
He was in Chicago for a large part.
But you talk about there was a time when he would go to breakfast at a certain diner every day, but he was surrounded by FBI guys.
Yeah, right.
Just take us through that.
Yeah, by military intelligence. So he wasn't particularly liked by the top leadership because he was always kind of trying to overstep the military leadership, and Leslie Groves, who was the general who headed up the Manhattan Project in particular, wanted the scientists to sort of stay in their lane. They wanted them to be completely separate from political military decisions about how the bomb was going to be used. And so compartmentalization, which was this policy of secrecy that meant, people only needed to know the amount they needed to know, also served to suppress any kind of dissent, to set a standard for how scientists were to engage, which was on the political level not at all. And Szilard didn't like that, and so he's always kind of pushing the envelope and pissing people off. And so they saw him as a threat, so they did kind of have him tailed, and there were times when he was almost pushed out of the project entirely, but managed to keep his way in there.
And could he have stopped the bomb, do you think? Could the bomb have been stopped?
So, I mean, it's interesting to think, what if he had never, say, talked to Einstein? Would it have been started, or how would it have been started?
Because remember, just to recap, and a lot of people watching this or listening to this will not have heard of Leo Szilard until now. He was the man who created the first nuclear chain reaction, as you mentioned earlier. And that is something that we have to keep coming back to. He's really the father of this, but he's not that well known. I'm sorry, carry on.
Oh, no, yeah. So, right. So it's interesting to think of what would have happened if he had never been a part of this story. But my thinking is that once the project is in motion and you're in a world war and it's as brutal and as long as it is, and scientists think that other people are going to develop the bomb, and even after it's clear that they're not, my thinking is kind of that ship has probably sailed. I don't know that it was possible to stop it.
So do you think human beings would have eventually come up with this weapon eventually without there being, like if Japan had surrendered for another reason, maybe a bit later or whatever, do you think the world would have the bomb today?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. I mean, I think sometimes about, like, if these discoveries that made the bomb possible had happened when we weren't on the edge of a world war, maybe we still would have had a bomb, but maybe, Leo Szilard and a lot of other scientists, they advocated for, like, international cooperative governance around nuclear weapons. And so if it had been a different time, would we have not used it, or somehow had agreements that prevented nations from building them? But I don't know. People
it's
are
hard
warlike,
to say.
right?
And
people like to have power, so...
And also, if we look at one of the examples here in the 1950s in Britain, Britain had their bomb, because the Hiroshima and Nagasaki were American bombs. So then Britain got its own bomb that we were testing in Australia at Maralinga. And we had spies in Cambridge who were communists, Burgess, Philby, what was it? Anyway, they're very famous spies, went and sold the details of the bomb to the Russians. And this was in like the 1950s. So you have to wonder whether, if the Russians didn't get the American bomb, they would have got the British bomb. And if they didn't, they got that, they could have got the French bomb. And, other countries ended up sorting it out. So you have to wonder whether it was just a matter of time anyway that we'd be
absolutely.
in what became, the threat of total nuclear annihilation, as hot or cold as that became through the years. Probably the closest was Cuban Missiles Crisis, I'm guessing. But who knows? There may have been times when we got just as close, but we'll never know when that was.
Right.
So
there
how
are a
did
lot
you
of near misses that are scary?
do you know more about them, about near misses?
They're just, I sort of have read a little bit. This hasn't been my major area of focus, but there are stories of during the Cold War when like a flock of swans were mistaken for nuclear missiles, and we're this far away from somebody pushing that button. Weather planes. There was a nuclear bomb accidentally, luckily it was unarmed, but they didn't know that at the time, like accidentally dropped on North Carolina, like an American one, that just like wound up in, I don't know, some guy's field. So it's, it's pretty frightening. There's an excellent book. Let's see, Command and Control by Eric Schlosser, something like that, that is sort of about the frightening state of nuclear insecurity and all of the near misses and all of the accidents that we haven't heard about.
Right. So we nearly had a real life Dr. Strangelove thing going on.
Right.
Yeah. So how did you get involved with the BBC World Service?
Yeah. So it was a bit random, to be honest. I have no experience in radio.
Right. Oh, I see. Because listening to your stuff, it's very, from a pair of British ears, it's very This American Life kind of PBS kind of style. So obviously you were influenced by that kind of storytelling, but you don't. I thought you must have come from that back. What is your background then?
So I'm a writer.
Right.
And I love podcasts. I love This American Life. I love a lot of that kind of nonfiction storytelling, and I've been kind of looking for my in for a long time. So this was a great opportunity.
Well, they don't get much bigger than the BBC, on a world stage.
They reached out to me. They found
They
my
did
writing.
What from your writing?
Yeah.
Okay.
So.
And then what
they
happened?
Sort of had in mind that they wanted to focus on Leo Szilard, but we're looking for, I think, a way to make that story more, more unique, or frame it in a way that was interesting. And so they were interested in my personal connection.
Right. So then you did the writing, and they did all the imaging and the production?
So I actually wasn't the writer, which was also strange for me as a writer.
But they took your work.
Yeah, so they, the writer was A.C. Smith, and she did, the bulk of the research along with the producer, and then took sort of, and then, we talked about how does my story fit into this, and how does my voice fit into this, and I did, it was a obviously collaborative process where we're editing and rewriting together, and some of the parts that are my story are my writing, most of the bulk of those parts. So.
And did you do it?
It's a really different project than I've ever been a part of.
Did you enjoy it?
Oh yeah, it was really fun.
And
it was also I'm so used to doing everything myself, all the research, all of the writing, all of the everything, that to sort of be part of a team that was as excellent as the BBC was really exciting,
And was the BBC on this side of the Atlantic, or was it in the USA?
So it was actually based out of BBC Wales.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
So you're 3,000 or 4,000 miles away. You're not even on the coast you're not even near the ocean. You're right in the middle there in Minneapolis. So you're dealing with these people at BBC Wales. Wow. And you put it together. And was this during the pandemic?
Yeah, it was all last year. So I think they contacted me like early March.
Yeah,
so right before everything.
Just as it started. Yeah.
Shit
So
really hit
you're
the
not
fan.
gonna go into a local studio and record your bits then.
Right, and that was originally the plan, but obviously that changed, and so we had, as you have probably learned too, right, how to put up a home studio. But I did it.
This is my what you would call closet. Yeah.
Yeah. It looks very, well done. It's certainly better than my like mattresses on the wall, pillow forts that I had to build.
Yeah. And so then you voiced it all from where you are right now?
Yeah, I was actually, part of the time I was in Tennessee, which is where, ironically, where my grandfather like lived and worked in my grandparents' house.
Where
down
you'd
there,
originally
'cause
seen the photograph.
Yeah, exactly.
Same house.
Yeah, so that was interesting. Well, actually, that house has been torn down and they've built a new one, but same place.
Same site. Yeah.
Yeah, same site.
Yeah.
But then the rest of it was up here in Minneapolis.
So then when you heard it back, could you hear it as you went along, or did you just record your voice cold and then you didn't hear it till it was all fully produced? Because it is incredibly well produced. The way that they've used the sound effects and the music and the other voices and stuff, it really does tell the story well. Did you know that was what it was going to sound like when it was done?
I mean, so Glenn Tansley, the producer, had told me that the sound was going to be incredible. I knew...
It is incredible, yeah.
Yeah. I knew that Richard Gould from Skywalker Sound was involved, and I knew that Trevor Gureckis was doing the score, and I did get to hear the sort of main score early on, and I was just sort of stunned at how it set the mood.
Yeah.
It made me feel like sort of this mix of poignancy and fear and suspense and the ominousness all at once, even though I know like what the story is.
Yeah. And it really does get across that fact that you said earlier. You used the word legacy. I grew up under the threat of, nuclear war. I think we all did at some level. And it's not just a history piece about, how it was developed and how, the scientists worked on it and that kind of thing, and the the role of Leo Szilard. It isn't just that; it does connect it to the world we live in today, and a world we don't want to live in tomorrow if things got really hot. It is it's really, really well done and atmospheric, and as you say, the musical score and just the simplicity of that like drone that builds, and then you hear your voice, and your voice in the prologue, setting it up. Just I think it's a wonderful podcast. How many are in the series? Is it about 7?
I think it's 7. Yeah.
Yeah, it is 7, and the podcast series is called The Bomb. It's Emily Strasser. It's from BBC World Service. You can get it wherever you get your podcasts. It's on the BBC Sounds app as well. And hey, it's great to talk to you. Fascinating to talk to you.
Thank you.
What do you do next? Where do you go from here? What's the next big project?
Good question. Figuring it out. I have a book that is in progress, hopefully near finished, although the way that publishing works, I won't be able to tell you that you can buy it for another couple of years, right? Because it's all a slow process.
What's it
the book
about?
is more about my personal...
It's about...
Sorry. Oh, it's about my personal story and my journey, sort of researching my grandfather, researching the legacy of nuclear weapons, going to Hiroshima. So it's kind of the more focused on the personal elements that you get glimpses of in The Bomb. So that's my major project that I'm working on, but always looking for new things.
And how did it feel when you went to Hiroshima?
Oh, it was enormously emotional. I went there in 2015, which was the 70th anniversary of the bombing. And, it was someplace I felt like I needed to go eventually. I always had it in mind as the place that I needed to go at the end of this journey. And it took me a long time to feel sort of ready for that. And then the timing was also right with the anniversary. So I was able to I was able to stand at the hypocenter of the bombing, right? And this beautiful Peace Park that's really like lush and green. Some people ask me sometimes, oh, is it still radioactive there? Like, what is it like? And it's really, it's a really beautiful modern city because they had to rebuild a lot, and very lush. So it was kind of incredible to see the resilience of that place. And then also mostly incredible to talk to survivors and to hear their stories directly. Wow.
Yeah, I bet it's a sobering experience. I'm trying to think. I've not been there. The closest I can come to is I've been to Pearl Harbor, and I've been out to the memorial. Have you been there, Arizona?
I haven't. No. What was that like?
And that's really eerie because, you go there thinking, oh, I'm going somewhere where something historic happened. And I was a tourist. I'm in Hawaii, and, It was actually my honeymoon with my wife, and we said, oh, we should go and check out Pearl Harbor, it's really famous and all that.
Yeah.
And then when you get there and it gets pretty real, the Navy take you out on a boat onto the floating memorial over the Arizona, which is, the ship is there. And then the boat leaves. And you're there with just a few other people, and it's really eerie, and there's all the names on the wall. And they didn't take the bodies off the boat. They're still down there. And you're on this floating pond, and it all becomes very, very real, and you become a massive pacifist because it just seems, completely senseless that all these young men lost their lives. And that's just one of the ships that went down at Pearl Harbor, but that's the one where the memorial is. So I'm imagining Hiroshima is another sobering experience, but must be more so than just anything to do with like a war that wasn't that long ago. I mean, you go to in Britain, you can go to ancient battlefields,
right.
And it's that you don't feel that. But because this war wasn't that long ago, there's just something very real about it, and especially with the legacy that dropping that first bomb has left us with.
One of the things that was most eerie I found there, they have a peace museum right at the Hiroshima Peace Park, and they have things like lunch boxes that still have the charred remains of people's food, and they tell you what was in there, or they have dresses that have been burnt, or like fingernails, things that are very, very visceral and sudden, and you can just imagine any of us,
Yeah, because they're everyday items, so they're connected to who we are.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a fabulous podcast. Check it out if you can. Download it where you get your podcast. It's called The Bomb. Emily Strasser, great to talk to you. Thanks for being on Podcast Radio.
Thanks. This has been so fun, and I'm glad you like the podcast.
I do. It's brilliant. It really is brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you.